So, so far in chapter 6, we've been talking about, the first section, section 6.1 was kind of an overview of plants and animals and comparing their basic characteristics. Second section, 6.2, was on Kingdom Plantae. So far, when we've been talking about Kingdom Plantae, we've looked at the non-vascular plants, so the ones that don't have the vascular tissue or the conducting tubes that carry water and nutrients through the plant. So those included the mosses, and we talked about special properties that they had because because they don't have the vascular tissue. They're fairly small, short to the ground. They have to have water. They have to live in a really moist environment for reproduction to happen, and also because they don't have conducting tissues or even proper roots with storage capability for water. So they are fairly limited in terms of their size and things like that. So we talked about their reproductive strategies and looked at their life cycle. And then we talked about the seedless vascular plants, and the seedless ones are the ferns and horsetails and ferns and horsetails and whisk ferns and club mosses. And we said don't get the name confused because they aren't mosses. But we talked about how because they have vascular tissue, they can be a little bit bigger, but they don't produce seeds, so they still require water and a damp environment for the sperm to get to the egg for fertilization to happen in reproduction. They had the unique fronds for leaves and fiddleheads for the immature form, but they had the sori underneath the fronds that had they were making the spores, and some other interesting features that they had compared to the mosses. So remember, mosses, their relatives were the hornworts and the liverworts, but they were also very small. So then we started talking about the seed-bearing vascular plants, and they're, of course, more complex, and they can be really any size. There's no limitation to their size in that they produce seeds, and they have strong vascular tissue, so it can form a really sturdy stem. Like in the trees, they have really hard stems that can hold them fairly tall, fairly high. So we had two groups, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. We talked about the gymnosperms already. Remember, sperm means seed, and gymno means naked, so they're the ones that don't have the fruit around them. Instead, they usually have cones or cup-shaped things around them while they're being produced. So they include the conifers and the ginkgos and the cycads. And we talked a little bit about how they're adapted for living in all year round conditions, like in the winters here, how they can be evergreens. Some different features about them that allow them to withstand the heavy snows and things like that. So that would be good to know for your assignment and your test. So today, or this lesson, we're going to look at the angiosperms. And sperm, again, means seed, and angio means vessel. So they are the vessel, the seeds that are enclosed in vessels. In other words, they're the ones that have fruit around them to protect them. So they are the flowering plants. So they produce flowers and fruit. So we're going to take a closer look at them. These are the most abundant of all plants. There are more than 3/4 of all species are angiosperms. The second most abundant are the mosses. If you remember, we mentioned that when we went over them in class. But angiosperms are the most diverse, so that means a lot of different types, and most widespread, so they can find them pretty well anywhere. They have true roots, stems, leaves, and vascular tissue. Like we said, they produce flowers. Sometimes they're inconspicuous. In other words, you can't really notice them or see them, or we don't tend to pay attention to the fact that they have even a flower. But they do produce seeds that are enclosed within a fruit. The sporophyte is the dominant generation, and they include everything from deciduous trees, so they're ones that lose their leaves, the shrubs, herbs, grasses, vines, water plants, anything that we see and think of as flowers, those would be flowering plants. Now, the flowering plants are divided into two main groups or classes based on the number of seed leaves that form in the embryo. So if they only have one that forms, it's called monocot, because a seed leaf is a cotyledon, and so they call them a monocot, because mono means one. If they form two, then we call them dicots. So examples of monocots include grasses and lilies, orchids and irises, and dicots include roses, peas, cacti, daisies, maple trees, a lot of different ones. But there are other things that you can use, because we're not always going to be able to see the embryo. Other features that can help us figure out if a plant is a monocot or a dicot. And there's pictures just like this in your book, but there are other key things that you can look at. If maybe one feature you can't really see, then you can look at the other features to compare them. So, monocots, we said, have one cotyledon or one seed leaf, whereas dicots have two. Now that you can't usually see unless you're taking them and dissecting them right early in their development. The second thing you can look at are their leaves. Look at the veins in the leaves. Okay, if the veins are parallel, if they all run in the same direction, then they would be monocots. If they are branching, so if you look and there's branches in the leaves, then they would be dicots. Okay, so these would be nut-like or branching. So that's an easy one to see. You can also count their flower parts. So if it's a monocot, they're usually in multiples of 3. So they'd have 3 petals, and likely 3 sepals, and likely 3 stamens, and so on. So if you count the parts, they'd be multiples of 3. So they'd be like 3 or 6 or 9. Dicots would be multiples of 4 or 5. So this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. It would likely have 5 sepals, and 5 stamens, and so on. The last thing that you can look at is how their vascular tissue, or vascular bundles, their veins, if you want to think of them like that, are arranged in the stem. So if you did a little cross section or cut through the stem and then looked in the end, and they're just kind of scattered, then that would be a monocot. If instead they form a ring, then they would be considered a dicot. So we're going to look at a few examples. Are they monocots or dicots? Okay, so this first one, if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, there's 6 petals. There's 6 petals. And if you could see them all, 1, 2, 3, 4, you'd be able to see 6 stamens and probably 6 sepals. That's a multiple of 3. If you were to look at their leaves, you would see that the veins run parallel, but I don't have any others for you to look at right now. So this one would be a monocot. If we look at the sunflower, it would be really hard to count all the petals, and they might have lost some, so that's probably not the best thing to look at. If we looked at, let's see, sorry. Okay, let's look at the sunflower. Oh, look. There you go. So if we look at the sunflower, all of the veins don't run in the same direction in the leaf. Instead, they're branching to the sides and then have little branches off them. So it would be a dicot. Okay? Now this is called a pitcher plant. It's really cool. Pitcher plants, we have them on PEI. You can find them like in a boggy area, areas where the soil is really wet, and there's usually not very much nitrogen in those areas. And so these plants are unique in that they are insectivorous. They like to eat insects. So there's hairs on this part of the plant that are aiming downwards, that if a fly, Carrie, honey, can you turn that down, please? So if a fly or other insect goes down into here, because it's attracted to the smell of the liquid that's at the bottom, then it wouldn't be able to fly back out because of the hairs that are pointed downwards. So it's pretty cool. And then the insect would get tired of trying to get out, and it would just end up laying there in the liquid, and there's enzymes that the plant puts out and breaks down the insects, and then uses their all of their nutrients. This is its flower, so it's kind of hard to tell. Is it a monocot or a dicot? This is actually a modified leaf. So if we were to look, let's see, here's another picture. So the leaf has veins that are branching. Okay, they're not parallel. So it would be considered a dicot. Okay, the rose bush. So if I were with you right now, I could make that picture bigger, but I can't right now. But you can see it's hard to count all the petals, and some of them might have been lost again, so that's not a great way of telling. But if you look at the leaves, they branch outwards. Okay, they don't all run in the same direction. So it is a dicot. Now this, you should know this one. This is the lady slipper. And the lady slipper is our provincial flower. And you can find them. They're kind of hard to find, but you can find them near the edges of bogs, sometimes in the woods. But if you look at the leaves, it's hard to tell from the flower itself because it's a unique shape. So it's hard to count their parts. But if you look at the leaves, all of these veins run in the same direction. Okay, so it would be, you're right, a monocot. Okay, so we're going to be doing an activity where you have to figure out if the plants are monocots or dicots. So that is one activity we'll be doing. Another thing, I didn't give you one to label, but it'd be good if you find one and print it off and practice labeling it. But this is showing a cross-section of a leaf. Okay, and we looked at parts of a leaf on the microscope in one of our earlier labs. So if we look, remember the uppermost and the bottommost cellular level, just like in us, is like a skin. So they have an upper epidermis and a lower epidermis. Okay, so they're the uppermost or outermost cellular layers. But outside of that, they have a protective coating called the cuticle. And the cuticle is a waxy covering that prevents them from losing water. So it's really important. The middle stuff between the two layers of what we think of like skin, so between the two epidermal layers, is called mesophyll. And that's a middle spongy section. Okay? So if this is the top of the leaf, then right underneath it, there's got to be lots of chloroplasts in those cells, because that would be this part that's exposed most to the sun. So the palisade layer are really tightly fitting cells that are full of chloroplasts, and so they're the site of photosynthesis. Down below it's more loosely fitting cells, so we call them the spongy layer, and they kind of allow gases to move easily between here and here. So remember, carbon dioxide needs to go in for photosynthesis and oxygen needs to come out. And here are the little holes that they go in and out through, so they have to pass through here fairly well. Okay, so if you remember, the little holes in the bottom of the leaf are the stoma. One would be a stoma, plural would be stomata, and each one is surrounded by two guard cells, a pair of guard cells. And you should kind of recognize them. They're not on here, listed here, but you should know them from the earlier lab that we've had. These right here, we showed you them in the model in class, but those are the veins. Okay, so the veins that we tend to see on the leaf, that's what they look like if you were to cut them and have a cross section of them. So that is a bundle of vascular tissue, the conducting tissue. And there are two types. There's xylem and phloem. And I wouldn't necessarily expect you to be able to tell which is which on the diagram, because it'll be black and white, and it's kind of hard to tell unless you have a higher level understanding about them. But you should know what each carries. Okay, so xylem is the conducting tissue that carries water, and it only carries it in one direction. It carries it up from the roots up towards the top parts of the plant. Okay, so it carries water and dissolved minerals upwards. So if you think of when you put, I don't know if you've ever done it or not, but you can put food coloring in water and then stick a celery stick in the colored water, and then the color will go right up through the celery stick, and then the vascular bundles will be colored if you look at the end of the piece of celery. They do the same thing for carnations. So if they want to make them kind of colored on the ends of the petals, then they'll put the carnations in colored water. So that water and dissolved color is traveling up through the xylem. Now the phloem, think phloem and food. Phloem carries nutrients, and it can go in either direction, because you have to be able to, if the plant isn't getting enough, then you have to be able to get it from the storage areas. But when it's making it in the upper part of the plant, sometimes it needs to send it down to the other parts of the plants so that they can get food, or so that it can be stored. So that is the vascular tissue and the parts of the leaf. Now we're going to take a look at the parts of a flower. So the flower is the reproductive structure in the flowering plant. We have specialized leaves that have different jobs. So before the flower opens, these green leaves called sepals serve as protection, and they are still protective when it does open up, but they serve as protectors for surrounding and protecting the growing flower. The colorful, larger ones are the petals. Okay, so the petals are usually colorful and sometimes have like a landing pattern on them to attract pollinators. And sometimes they'll give off a certain smell to attract pollinators. And then we have the male part, which is called the stamen. So this whole thing in red is the male part. It's made up of the stick-like part, which is the filament, and then the anther, which is at the end. So the filament is just a little stalk that holds the anther up. The anther produces and stores pollen until it's time for the pollen to go and be pollinating plants. So the red is the male part. The blue is female. Okay, so the whole structure can be called a pistil or a carpel. You'll see it or hear it called either. It's made up of 3 parts. So this top part here is the stigma. Think sticky stigma. The stigma is sticky, and that's where the pollen grains will stick or land. Whenever a pollinator comes along, or when it's carried in the wind or whatever, the pollen will land on the stigma, and it'll travel down through the style. So this is the style, a stalk that supports the stigma and holds it up. And then at the bottom is the ovary. So this is the ovary, kind of like an ovary in us. It produces ovules, and the ovules are sacs. So sometimes this one just has 1 ovule, but sometimes they'll have several ovules. So it depends how many seeds are made inside of the flower. Okay, so the ovules are sacs that contain the female gametophyte, which produces the eggs. So you should know the parts and what their jobs are. And you have a sheet that you should be able to label now with all the different parts. I'm not going to go over them right now, but we'll go over them in class. A couple other things that they'll use to classify flowers. They might call them complete or incomplete. So if it's complete, then it includes all those parts that we just talked about. Okay, so it has the pistil, it has the stamen, it has the petals, and the sepals. Okay, so it has all of them. It has male and female parts, it has petals, and it has sepals. If it's missing any one of those, they'd call it incomplete. So if it's missing sepals, it'd be incomplete. If it's missing petals, it'd be incomplete. If it's only got male or female parts, it would be incomplete. Another way they classify them is as perfect or imperfect. So that has to do with whether it has both male and female parts or not. So if it has both, it's called perfect. Oh, you look handsome, my little man. If it has both male and female parts, so both stamen and pistil, it would be perfect. If it only has one, then it would be imperfect. And we also use special terms to say whether it's male or female. Okay, so this one is missing the male parts. So it does have the female parts, so it would be a female flower. We'd call it imperfect because it doesn't have both male and female parts. We call it incomplete because it doesn't have all those parts that were listed. But we'd also call it pistillate because that's a term that they would use to say it's female. Okay, so pistillate is even more, gives even more information than just saying it's imperfect. Imperfect is just saying it's either male or female, but pistillate says, oh, it's a female. Staminate is the opposite. So a staminate flower is one that just has the stamens. So it would be a male flower. Okay, so those are some terms that they'll use. Reproduction in angiosperms. So it's a little bit more complicated. Same general thing happens as with the cone-bearing plants or the gymnosperms. So the pollen grains have to land and they'll develop a pollen tube, and the sperm is going to swim down through and fertilize an egg in the ovule. Okay. A little bit of differences in terms of the parts, so where it's going to land and where it's going to go to. Okay, so the pollen grain will land on the stigma, the sticky stigma. It will form a pollen tube, so it grows the pollen tube, and then 2 sperm cells are going to go down through the pollen tube. One of them is going to fuse with the egg and form a zygote. And the other one is going to fuse with another cell that's there, another couple of cells that are there, in order to make the food stuff. So we're going to look at another picture for that. Okay, so the pollen grains are released, from the anther, and they're going to either travel in the wind or be carried by a pollinator or whatever to a plant, unless it's self-fertilizing, which a lot of times the plants won't allow to have happen. So whatever the case, the pollen grains are going to land on the sticky stigma. They'll form a pollen tube. The two sperm are going to travel down, into the ovule and find the eggs. So here is an egg. Here are the two sperm. They're going to fertilize one of the eggs to make a zygote, and they'll fuse with other cells that are there to form the foodstuff, which we call the endosperm. So inside of a seed that forms, there'll be the embryo and the endosperm for an angiosperm reproduction, or reproduction in a flowering plant. So we call it double fertilization. That zygote is going to undergo mitosis. So as soon as it divides once, we call it an embryo. And then eventually the seed will be in the right conditions. If it's going to germinate, it has to be in the right conditions, and then it'll germinate to form the new plant. So the sporophyte is the whole plant, including the flower. The gametophytes are really tiny. So the male gametophyte is found inside of the anther, inside of the pollen grains. The female gametophyte is inside of the ovule. So they're really tiny compared to the sporophyte generation. So that's about it. There's a really good animation. I'm not going to show it to you through here, but I will link it from the website and Edmodo. Please watch it because it'll be helpful to you. And this is just another showing the same kind of thing. So inside of the ovule, meiosis will happen. So we get a megaspore, that is going to form the archegonium, or the female gametophyte that makes the egg. In the meantime, meiosis happens in the anthers to give microspores that are forming the pollen grains. The pollen grain lands on the stigma, grows a pollen tube, down into the ovary, down through the style, into the ovary, and into the ovule, so that the two sperm can go in. We call it double fertilization because one sperm fuses with the egg to make the zygote. The other sperm fuses with the other cells that are there to make the endosperm. And the endosperm, it fused with two cells, so they get 3 copies of chromosomes. So we call it 3N because it has 3 copies of the chromosomes. The zygote, like usual, is 2N, or diploid, because it has a copy from the sperm that came in and a copy from the egg. So a copy of all the chromosomes of the sperm, and a copy from the egg. So this is the seed. Eventually, if conditions are right, it will germinate to form a new plant. Now, something you should notice, so the ovule with the embryo inside, the ovule becomes the seed. The ovule had the egg inside, fertilization happens inside of it, Then it forms a tough coat around it, forming the seed. What's around that, so the ovary, okay, at the base of the flower, the ovary is what develops into the fruit. So if we think of the fruits that we eat, then the fruit came from the ovary. The seeds came from the ovules. Awesome. So that's it for this section of angiosperms. We will be talking about a few other things through questions in class. But I would practice labeling the leaf and practice, reading the reproduction cycle, the life cycle. Labeling the flower, make sure you know all the parts. Take a look at some pictures of them and see, is it complete or incomplete? Is it perfect or imperfect? How do I tell if it's a male flower or a female flower? So is it pistillate or is it staminate? And yeah, if you have any questions anytime, remember, just email or call or text.